This episode of New Politics was released on the 13th of July, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Whadjuk people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, more fear and division brought to you by the Leader of the Opposition and the mainstream media. Is there a time and place for religious influence in politics? And will there be an early federal election? I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, Special Envoy for Disappointing Governments.
Just a reminder, we don't have the billionaire owners or even the millionaire owners to support us, and that's the way that we'd like to keep it. But if you would like to support New Politics, you can do that through Patreon or Substack, or you can make a donation at newpolitics.com.au, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. It's been a festival of Islamophobia in the media this week, and it was kick-started by the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, when he said this.
I think what it does demonstrate is that the Prime Minister, if he's in a minority government in the next term of Parliament, it will include the Greens, it'll include the Green Teals, it'll include Muslim candidates from Western Sydney. It will be a disaster. If you think the Albanese government is bad now, wait for it to be a minority government with the Greens, the Green Teals and Muslim independents.
And this was in response to the resignation of Senator Fatima Payman last week from the Labor Party to sit as an independent senator. And there's been thinly veiled racist analysis throughout most of the mainstream media, and that's through 7 West Media, 9 Media, Network 10 and the ABC. Not so thinly veiled racist attacks coming from News Corporation. Here's someone who we can officially call a racist according to Australian law, Andrew Bolt.
First, Muslim Senator Fatima Payman. Today quit Labor, the party that got her elected, and she'll now sit as an independent for now. And Australian politics just got more dangerous. And let me go through my problems with what Payman has done and said. Now first, her preaching of victimhood today. No one knows victimhood like a Muslim woman, this Muslim woman, a refugee from Afghanistan.
Now let's put aside the rights and the wrongs of Senator Payman's decision last week because, David, we've already copped enough abuse about this, and I've been told so many times to go back to where I came from. And this week I'm actually in Perth, which is where I came from, so I'm happy to oblige some of our more extreme members of the audience. But it doesn't take very much for the mainstream media to dive very quickly into the depths of racist cliches and play the anti-Islam card. And while overall Australia, I think, is a very, very successful multicultural country, when it comes to the media and the politics, well, it just doesn't seem to be very accepting at all.
You're right. The media doesn't do diversity very well. It sometimes tries. People like Waleed Ali and Stan Grant and Fawzia Ibrahim on air. But the usual underlying mainstream message is that white Anglo culture is dominant, and that's probably arguably correct, but should be dominant, and you shouldn't have other voices unless they agree broadly with the dominant paradigm. So Waleed, Stan Grant, both have espoused what might be seen as conservative views, or at least moderate views. Fawzia Ibrahim had a whole list of left-wing Twitter followers who she called lobotomized shitheads, and I was outraged, mainly because we weren't on it, Eddie. I don't know how we missed out, but...
Well, I was most upset about that.
Yes. We've got to speak louder, I guess, and be less reasonable. Rita Panahi in The Telegraph, again, speaks broadly in line with mainstream Anglo culture. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do this. Everyone is entitled to their opinion. I'm not saying that I agree with their takes either. But that's the beauty of living in a multicultural democracy. We can all have different views. Also, and I think this is fair to say, that people of different backgrounds don't necessarily have the same view as everybody else in that background. I think that's really important to remember. And of course, I'm excluding SBS. And I suppose you could look at the treatment of various governments of SBS. how Australia likes its different views. They keep cutting the budget. They force it to have advertising. They try and get SBS to get less exclusives, etc., etc. Nonetheless, it is very much throughout television, radio, and print news, very much Anglo and male and moderate or centre-right to further right in the views.
And it's not just the media, it's also the political system as well. That doesn't do diversity very well at all. And it's not like we're just sitting here trying to promote some unreal leftist agenda here. Australia is actually a very diverse country, and it's just that our politics and media is taking a very long time to catch up with the reality of Australia. And for sure, the federal parliament elected in 2022 was the most diverse parliament ever elected in Australia's history, but it's still a long way behind what Australia is really, really like. And there was an outrage a few weeks ago when the ABC journalist Laura Tingle suggested that Australia is a racist country, and that discussion or debate went on for a couple of weeks. And I think this is another good example of this. The mainstream media promoting Islam as a threat and pushed by a leader of the mainstream political party, that's Peter Dutton. And it seems like there's just a knee-jerk reaction to anything that's out of the ordinary, a little bit different. And these are really easy pickings for politicians and lazy journalists. And over the past week, it just hasn't been conservative politicians. It's been both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party that's been pushing the anti-Islam issue, albeit in different ways. But I think the political system has also still got a long way to go before it starts talking about practicing actual diversity.
One of the ridiculous things that shouldn't happen in our parliament is every day they open with the Lord's Prayer. I don't think it should open with the Lord's Prayer. I think that it excludes anyone of a non-Christian background. Now, the words are lovely and probably express in some ways the types of things we should aspire to. But, and it's a big but, it's within a Christian context. How many of our parliamentarians are at least nominally Christian? It's less than half. There's Islamic members of parliament, there's Jewish members of parliament. I don't think we have any Hindu members of parliament at a federal level, and that's a gap. There's quite a few atheists and agnostics. And so why we have this antiquated, archaic, exclusionary ritual at the beginning of every day of parliament, it makes a mockery of the religion too. It makes a mockery of Christianity. Now, I know there are some of you out there who are saying, well, that's not a bad thing, is it? But we shouldn't be mocking the personal beliefs of the constituents.
Oh, well, I guess it's not so much people of religious backgrounds, but it's people of different sort of backgrounds.
Exactly.
Not necessarily religious, but from different cultural backgrounds.
Having Hindu practitioners would suggest people from India, for example, who make up a large proportion of Australia's immigration. We should allow Parliament to be as broad as possible. Now, and again, that gets back to the parties and who they pre-select and why they pre-select. It's really poorly managed. And a lot of this stuff isn't that much of a change. It's a quick motion in Parliament to scrap the Lord's Prayer. I can guarantee you the 5% of people who would rage against that will be ignored. I think even a lot of believers would say, you can certainly, if it's part of your daily ritual to say a quick prayer before you go in or do some kind of personal religious ritual before you go in, that's fine. I wouldn't want anybody to not do that. But everybody shouldn't be forced into paying lip service to something that they possibly don't believe in. When you take the oath of office, you can choose to swear on the Bible or any book you like or nothing. You can just do the oath and it carries in law the same weight. So, I think that's terrific. So if you want to use the Torah or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or
the Tibetan Book of the Dead,
the complete works of Sherlock Holmes, it doesn't matter. It carries the same weight in a court of law. So if you break that oath, you should be in a lot of trouble. Whether you are or not is a whole other argument for a whole other podcast on another day. But there's really glimmers of hope. But we've just got to get rid of some of these more ridiculous, arcane, because it's not really tradition. The other thing, too, I want to point out here is that the first parliament weren't all Christians. And Australia was never really set up as a Christian nation. It was set up as a secular nation where you were free to practice whatever religion you liked. There were Unitarians and Trinitarians. There was spiritualists. Alfred Deakin, no one knew this at the time, but it turned out later, he turned out to seances and try and speak with the dead, and was a very big fan of Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement. So to try and bring in a tradition. Now, Christianity was the official religion, but anyone could have run for parliament in theory. Bob Hawke, in the Australia Act in 1986, turns Australia into a secular country, which was the right move. It meant that you could be free to live your life and practice your beliefs as best as you could, provided they were legal. I really don't see a problem with that. And I know that a lot of people of faith don't see a problem with that either.
And a few of our listeners have suggested that with the mainstream media, well, how much of an effect does this all have? And we've talked quite bitterly about the media today. And there's also suggestions that we might be too ensconced in analysing the media and might be overplaying the effects of it. And some of that might be true. But the coverage and influence of the mainstream media is diminishing, and it's spiralling downhill very quickly, and more quickly than I thought it might be. And there's the telltale signs. Ratings are down. There's less people watching the legacy mainstream media. There's more options available out there as well. More staff have been made redundant at News Corporation in recent times. And News Corporation is the largest employer of journalists and media staff in Australia. And we've talked about the diversity of Australia. And Australia is a very diverse country. And I think because of that diversity and the technological change that's been happening over the past 10, 15, 20 years, there are diverse levels of engagement with different media and different formats. And I think there's also more cynicism and scepticism about politics out there as well. And I think it's also a case where just because someone sees Peter Dutton ramping up the fear of Islam in Western Sydney, or if they hear Andrew Bolt going on about Muslims on Sky News, well, that doesn't mean that they change their vote in that instance. So it's probably a case of just reinforcing existing prejudices more than anything else. But I think it just shows that schism between politicians and media on one side and the electorate on the other, I think that schism is just growing larger because they're trying to appeal to an audience that they don't really understand anymore.
I've pointed out before, I think, that we listen to the media when it agrees with what we say, or when we agree with what it says. The voice referendum, before then, to the media pushing another Morrison government, and overwhelmingly Australia voted for the Albanese government. Then in the voice referendum, the media pushed for a no vote, and that's what Australia voted. And I think what happened is that the people will listen to the media when it agrees with what they say. I think the influence of the media in Australia has diminished a lot. We can see it in the general distaste of Peter Dutton's policies in the mainstream. They're pushing him as the strong leader, the great leader, and look at all these marvellous policies. You don't need the detail because the sun doesn't go up till he's given it permission and the moon comes out, all of that stuff. Yet he is highly unlikely to become Prime Minister. And I think, too, the disappointment that some people have in the Albanese government isn't because the media is consistently pushing an anti-Albanese government line. It's because people are disappointed that, in some cases, for understandable, if not actual reasons, and in some cases because they're expecting way too much.
Oh, but also I think politicians these days of all persuasions and all perspectives, they've got a more sophisticated understanding of how to directly relate to the electorate. But it's still that they're dependent on the mainstream media, even though that's sort of diminishing quite substantially. And I think that creates an issue as well, or creates problems in both politics and media, where politicians are still dependent on the media or the mainstream media to get their messages out. And that's possibly a problem where that link has been broken within the mainstream media, yet politicians of all persuasions are still using that broken model to communicate with their electorate.
Habits are hard to break, aren't they? And I think the psychological effect of seeing a newspaper clipping or a headline about yourself has a much more potent effect. So government and opposition and crossbenchers still, to a greater or lesser extent, play to the big players because they don't want to annoy them. And of course, we all know that power must be taken, not given, but we do give power to things that we think we should give power to. And the mainstream media still convinces the government that it's important and can be listened to. If the government and the opposition, but if the government stood up and had a proper inquiry into media ownership, if it started taking licenses off people, if it started ignoring what the mainstream media had to say, I think we'd see a big difference. This takes courage. Of course, it could backfire. I'm just some rando on the internet. But I have noticed things in the past. It does take courage, it does take a bit of resolve, and it does take a bit of discipline, because there will be the howls of disappointment and remonstration, which will slowly fade away. One thing we can be sure of is that given the choice between easy and hard, governments will do the easy things most of the time, and status quo is easy.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
I found nothing, heat of the sun, it burns like those words, how they haunt me now. Life could be easier, but could this make me go a little bit deeper? I hear the thunder is coming.
There is a new group in Australia called the Muslim Vote, and it's not a political party. It seeks to educate and mobilise voters primarily about issues related to the events in Palestine, and it will be supporting independent candidates in seats held by the Labor Party, initially in Western Sydney and outer Melbourne. And this is similar to the model adopted by Climate 200, which supported independents in key Liberal-held seats in the 2019 and 2022 federal elections and gave rise to the teal independence. But the Muslim Vote has given rise to howls of protest from the mainstream media, which is now claiming that Sharia law is just around the corner and Australia is going down a dangerous path. But politics in Australia is littered with religion. Albanese keeps going on about the Catholic Church, Scott Morrison with his Pentecostalism. We also had the Christian Democrats in New South Wales Parliament. They also run in federal campaigns as well. And just as a reminder, you mentioned the Lord's Prayer before, David. Here's Bronwyn Bishop opening Parliament with the Lord's Prayer in 2013.
Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread.
So it seems that some religion in politics is okay as long as it's not Islamic. Even something like Pentecostalism or Mormonism, which is much smaller than Islam in Australia and more extreme, seems to be acceptable in Australian politics. Now, it would be better if religion was completely out of politics, and I think it's that more conservative brand of Christianity that has taken roots within Australian politics. But if it's going to be there, we can't really pick and choose what's acceptable and what's not.
No, the ultimate arbiter of everything should be the electorate. Who is in government? They were voted in, hopefully with a majority, but certainly with a majority of seats. What is the government's policies? It's been determined by the membership who've presented it to the public, who have decided, yes, we would rather live with this set of policies than the other set of policies, or another set of policies. And Australia as a nation is dropping in its religious belief. Less people go to church now than ever have before, or attend any religious celebrations. There's still people out there who attend church regularly. I nearly said religiously, and that's perfectly okay, should not be messed with. If people said we're going to ban this type of church going, I'd be one of the first to say, hold on, that's a bit stupid, isn't it? Yet the religious wings of political parties aim for power, probably most disastrously in Victoria. And at this point, we say hello to our friends in Shady Sukha land, as we've watched the Victorian Liberal Party continually self-destruct as it's been taken over by Pentecostalism. They tried it in New South Wales, and the New South Wales Liberal Party has a lot of more extreme Pentecostal members and Catholic members, Dominic Perrottet, for example. But the New South Wales one seems to be and I'm saying this very gingerly and very tentatively, seems to be correcting itself a bit, because I think partly they've seen what happened to Victoria. The takeover by Pentecostal factions there failed. And I think the Victorian Liberal Party is in a state of unelectability. Queensland's a bit different, but it'll be interesting to see how the Liberal factions of the Liberal National Party go as opposed to the national factions in the state election that's coming up. And Catherine Deves is a warning, a Liberal member in one of the safest Liberal seats, and gets hammered out by a relatively secular Zali Steggall. I don't know what Zali Steggall's personal beliefs are. I don't really need to know, because she seems to be working in favour of her whole community. This is, again, not an endorsement of everything she agrees with or everything she said, but good local members are good local members. Catherine Deves didn't get anywhere near winning the seat of Warringah back. And I don't quite know how they could have thought she had, except Pentecostal churches are superficially large. They always mention the weekly numbers. They don't mention the turnover.
Well, it's also less than 1% of the Australian population as well.
Exactly. But you surround yourself with like-minded people and, everybody I know is voting for me. And that may be true, but you don't know 99% of the people out there. And to get back to Muslim vote, the howls of outrage that interested, intelligent people might want to make sure that the types of people that they associate with or identify with are properly informed as to what political parties are doing. And they may run a candidate or two, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. It seems at this point that's not the whole aim of it, that they just want to make sure that people of a Islamic background know the issues.
Oh, that's right. And there is a Muslim vote group in Britain. It's not related to the Muslim vote in Australia, but it did have some effect in the recent British election. And there were 4 independent candidates supported by Muslim vote that won seats in a contest with British Labor candidates, and they also dented the majorities in many other seats in the British election. And the British Parliament has got 650 seats, so 4 is not that many, but it's still something. And this is definitely something for the Australian Labor Party to ponder at the next federal election. And in the UK, Muslim vote was primarily a protest about government inaction over Palestine, and in Australia it's pretty much the same. The tagline for Muslim vote is justice for Palestine. That's in a big banner on its main website, and there are key seats in Western Sydney that could be affected. The seat of Watson, that's where you are, David. That's the seat held by Tony Burke, and the Islamic population in that seat is around 25%, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. In the seat of Blaxland, that's next door, that's held by Jason Clare. The Islamic population in that seat is around 31%. And it's not a case where just because someone is from an Islamic background, they will vote for an independent candidate from an Islamic background. It's a lot more complicated than that. But even if it's half of those people, that's starting to push those 2 seats into marginal territory. And it depends on the quality of those candidates and who else is running. And some people might think, it's just only 2 seats. What's the problem? But when the Labor government has only got a 5-seat majority and possibly nominally losing 1 seat through redistributions, every single seat becomes important.
The thing we could compare it to, and nobody really has, they've been comparing it to the teal movement. But I think we can probably go back a little bit further and look at the rise of One Nation. Now, that's not to say that Muslim votes is anywhere inequivalent to One Nation, but in terms of a group of relatively disaffected people finding a voice and potentially damaging a party. Now, John Howard, again, not a man I admire very much, but we can learn a lot from his prime ministership and the way he dealt with things. John Howard was able to manage that and bring in the One Nation voters back to the Liberal Party. He'd learned from the Joe for PM campaign in 1986.
Well, he was very adept at harvesting those One Nation votes.
Yeah, exactly. Now, it had a long-term detrimental effect on Australia in that it pushed the parliament to the right, it pushed the Liberal Party to the right, and now we find a Liberal Party out of step with the electorate and possibly on its way out as an electoral force. But if the Labor government can look at what the grievances are, work out what the legitimate ones are, what the ones that maybe aren't so legitimate, although I suspect most of them are legitimate, I haven't looked at all of them, and bring these people back into the Labor fold, they'll have done a few things. Of course, the lunatic fringe are saying, oh, it's all about Sharia law, without really understanding what Sharia law is. And when you look at it, they just want their own version of it. They just don't want it to be Muslim. They want it to be Christian Sharia law, chopping the hands off thieves and making sure women have no right to this and that. And I will also say that a lot of Islam doesn't believe in any of that. In the vast majority of Islamic thinking doesn't believe in any of it. But again, our media can't cope with diversity of thought in large groups because they don't have diversity of thought. So why would a group of hundreds of thousands of people have different views and even opposing views?
And I think in the context of all of this, it's still hard to understand the Labor government's political behaviour. Now, I've always felt that political parties and their politicians should be able to have that skill in being able to manage conflicting issues and navigate a pathway through that keeps all sides of an issue satisfied to some extent and reducing the political risks for themselves. And I think John Howard did that very, very well with One Nation in the 1990s. But it just seems that for this Labor government, they just cannot see the wood for the trees on the issue of Palestine. And they have lost a senator over this issue. And without going through the rights and wrongs, the fact is that they did lose a senator that they didn't need to. And they could be on the way to losing 2 or 3 seats in Western Sydney because of siding pretty much with Israel rather than Palestine, when good political leaders should be able to navigate the pathway with both sides. And that, to me, would be good politics. And it is strange behaviour, losing a senator and possibly majority government at the next election. And their actions now on Palestine will not help them win any seats in other areas around Australia, I don't think. And it does show that the level of influence that the right-wing Israel lobby does have within Australian politics. And another piece of odd political behaviour this week was the Prime Minister's decision to appoint a special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, Gillian Siegel. Here's the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, making the announcement.
Members of the Jewish community whose children are worried about wearing their school uniform in our capital cities. That's not acceptable.
And I guess that is a problem, but it's probably not as bad as school children being bombed into oblivion in Gaza. But I'm really not sure how all of this will help. Gillian Siegel is pro-Israel. She's a Zionist. She supports the actions of the Israel Defence Forces and supports everything that they are doing in Gaza. So to me, this seems like a very, very strange choice. So Labor has sided with the conservative side of the Jewish community, and I don't want to be accused of anti-Semitism or fall foul of this new special envoy, so instead, here's the CEO of the Jewish Council of Australia, Sarah Schwartz, outlining some of the problems with this appointment.
Anti-Semitism is a serious issue, and we know that it's rising, but what we've seen the Albanese government do today is appoint an anti-Semitism envoy who, instead of having a background in fighting anti-racism and academic credentials to back that up, rather he's appointed an envoy with a track record in previous roles of lobbying for Israel, of opposing voices that support Palestinian human rights, and painting all Jewish people as supportive of Israel's actions, when we know that in fact there are many Jewish people like myself and other people around the country who support Palestinian freedom and human rights. And so there are real concerns that this appointment will be used for political purposes to lobby for Israel, to stifle voices in support of Palestinian human rights, and ultimately in a way that does not make Jewish people more safe.
As we've pointed out many times before, there are many people in the Jewish community in Australia who are opposed to the actions of Israel, are prepared to speak out against Zionists, who are supportive of the rights of Palestine and are absolutely outraged by the events in Gaza, but we don't hear from them very often, and the Labor government certainly doesn't take any notice of them. So the Prime Minister did say that he'll appoint a special envoy to combat Islamophobia, but why didn't he announce that first or at the same time? Islamophobia has been a big issue for the Islamic community for such a long time in Australia, and if he's going to have these special envoys, well, where will it end? Will there be a special envoy for Pentecostals or a special envoy for atheists? Their concerns have been ignored for a long, long time, so maybe there should be a special envoy for atheists too.
I think we need a special envoy for podcasters. It makes no sense. We already have a anti-discrimination commissioner. Look, anti-Semitism is appalling. It's bad. It's wrong. You shouldn't be targeted for being of a certain background. You shouldn't be targeted for anything. You can be argued with, that's fine. You can be disagreed with, that's fine. But you shouldn't be targeted because of your background or beliefs. But I don't think we need somebody telling us in particular that this is wrong. And yeah, as you pointed out, why didn't they announce the anti-Islamophobia special envoy at the same time and say, look, in Australia, we don't have these problems. We can all work together. We can all live together. We can all play together. We can marry each other. There's no legal or social ban against this. If you've got problems, if you see enough, come and see us and we'll see what we do. Meanwhile, the Anti-Discrimination Commission is thinking, well, I'm here. It's what we do. We've been doing a great job for the last 20 years or so. So it seems to me that the special envoy is some kind of sop. She's probably hammered in for 3 years on a contract. So getting rid of the position, which they might do very quietly in a few weeks, is going to be expensive. But I think that's the only choice they've got.
I'm actually looking forward to the final report sent through by text message.
Oh, yeah, I hope so. We've got to beat racism. We've got to beat anti-Semitism. We've got to beat anti-Islam. We've got to beat all of it. It's gotten better. The treatment we still have of Indigenous people here, and we had the chance to fix that and we blew it. I think there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction and not a lot of thinking through, and it's time to let the more cautious side of the government take over and think, hold on, how do we combat this? How do we make sure that every Australian citizen is living safely and peacefully and without being harassed or bothered for who they are? And I think that's the question that should be asked, not how do we protect certain areas of mainstream society.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
There is speculation that an election could be called soon, and some speculation is that it could be August the 31st, and that's just around the corner. And this is the usual election speculation that goes on after 2 years of a parliamentary term. Now, it's not clear why the media has started ramping this up right now. The government is really not going to risk 10 months of its time in office to extend that time by 2 years. That's essentially what the trade-off is, and this is not really a risk worth taking. I think the election is more than likely going to be in November this year, or even more likely to go to full term towards April or May 2025. And the theory behind early election speculation is that interest rates are going to rise after August, and the past two governments that have had interest rate rises during the election campaign have gone on to lose the election, and that was in 2007 and 2022. And there are redistribution issues that means that it's more favourable for the government to wait until March next year. And there's also the Queensland election in October that could act as a litmus test for how the Labor Party is travelling overall. And I realise that there's differences between state and federal politics, but having a Labor government going to an election, even if it is at a state level, that gives the federal party an idea of how it's going overall within the electorate. So there is speculation about the election date, but there's also speculation about Peter Dutton and his leadership credentials. And he failed to get any traction on the nuclear energy debate over the past few weeks, but he's still trying to ramp this up. He's latching on to as many divisive issues as possible, and we saw that this week with his commentary about the Muslim vote in Western Sydney. So he's a very negative person. He's a divisive person, and the media does try to highlight him at every opportunity. The ABC referred to Peter Dutton as the shadow Prime Minister, and that's a term that we've never actually heard of before. But here's Malcolm Turnbull giving his character assessment of Peter Dutton on the project.
What sort of Prime Minister will Peter Dutton make if he wins?
I think that's something we should contemplate with dread.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Don't hold back, Malcolm. Don't hold back.
Why?
Well, he's a thug. And look, Peter's got one tune that he plays. I mean, and it's been all his political life. And that is division and animosity, generally targeted at immigrants. It is real. I couldn't think of anyone less suited to be Prime Minister of a multicultural society like Australia.
We do have to remember that Peter Dutton orchestrated the leadership challenge against Malcolm Turnbull back in 2018. So there is a little bit of animosity between those two, but there is a bit of movement behind the scenes going on within the Liberal Party, and it explains why Peter Dutton is going so hard on these divisive issues and still trying to push nuclear as far as possible. Now, there's a key faction within the Liberal Party that loves nuclear and loves pushing these divisive issues, and Peter Dutton is trying to keep their support. But that's probably the main reason why there might be an earlier election if the Liberal Party does change its leadership in the short term.
It's clear that Tony Abbott, who was lauded as being a great opposition leader when he was in opposition, actually wasn't that good an opposition leader. The best opposition leaders, I'm thinking here of Gough Whitlam, of John Howard. Again, I'm not a fan of Howard, but fair is fair. Robert Menzies in 46, 47. Bill Hayden. And Bill Hayden's a bit different because he doesn't win. But they tended to not just oppose the government, but give an alternate idea of what their government might look like and how they might have done things differently or what policies they would have used to do things differently. Tony Abbott never did that. He just opposed. He said no to everything, even when it damaged him, even when it came across as being cold-hearted. There was the Labor member whose wife was in labour and they wouldn't give a pair. So he had to go to Parliament while his child was being born. And that was just appalling. And it wasn't even a major vote. It was just absolutely appalling. The undignified and immature run to the Parliament doors so they wouldn't be caught having to vote on something they wanted to abstain from, him and Christopher Pyne. What it showed was that Abbott was completely unfit to be Prime Minister. And what happens? He becomes Prime Minister and he's completely unfit and gets dumped 2 years later, less than 2 years later. Same thing with Dutton. He's not actually giving us what a Dutton government would look like, except in how he's opposing things. We know we're going to get another negative, non-productive, inefficient, pointless government that doesn't actually achieve anything and that leaves no legacy. Now, I know that Dutton's side of politics wants to remove government altogether, but those types of ridiculous positions can be and should be safely ignored, particularly by government people. They should be in there showing why government is a useful thing, how it can be a useful thing, how it can be a better thing. Now, government will never be perfect, of course. There'll always be waste, there'll always be inefficiency, there'll always be the attempts at corruption, etc. And I think, too, the Australian people, having been burned by Abbott, by Turnbull and by Morrison, want something different from their Liberal Party and from their coalition.
Oh, I think that's correct. But I think that the Liberal Party has got a similar problem to the Labor Party. Its leadership is out of step with the general membership of the party. And the members tend to be to the left of the parliamentarians. And the Liberal Party members that I know tend to be more moderate. They're still centre-right, but not as far to the right as the Liberal Party room. So and I'm talking about Sydney rather than anywhere else. But Peter Dutton is a leader for Queensland, pretty much. The federal LNP holds most of the seats in Queensland, and Peter Dutton's style of leadership does go down very well in Queensland, but he just doesn't have very much support elsewhere. But I think that Dutton ramping up all the negativity on Islam could cost the Labor Party 2 or 3 seats, and in a finely balanced parliament, that could actually end up being significant. But these seats won't go to the Liberal Party. So as annoying and offensive as Peter Dutton's commentary is, I just don't think that it's going to result in any benefit for the Liberal Party. It might end up damaging the Labor Party, but it won't benefit the Liberal Party at all.
I think the electorate in general is sick of the negativity. I think the electorate in general wants positive, progressive, within the context of left or right. And the rise of the teals shows that even right-wing voters didn't want more of the same. And so the safest Liberal seats were lost. And I think in a broad sense, we're coming to the end of the party system as we've known it for the last 150 years or more. And really in Australia from what the Liberal Party, the Free Traders, I'll keep it simple, from 1901, society, politics was totally different. I think that we're heading towards the end of whether new parties spring up and we carry on as before, but with a slight realignment, and that's certainly possible. I'm not saying that won't happen. Or whether we work out that it's better to have essentially unaligned people voting for the Prime Minister. And it's not a party thing. It is who really holds the confidence of Parliament, this person or that person. Both sides have issues, of course, but I think the 19th, early 20th century philosophies that guide our modern parties may have passed their use-by dates. And as a historian, it pains me to say that, but as a historian, also realise that things come to an end and things change, and that parties should be reflective of what's going on at the time that they exist, not what was going on 50, 75, 100, 125 years ago.
And the next election, whenever it's held, whether it's August or in December or April 2025, and I think that it's more than likely going to be held in April next year, it could end up being a lot more unpredictable than we think, but for different reasons. Now, the feeling was that there would be more teal independents supported by the Climate 200 group, and they would be picking off seats from the Liberal Party, and the Labor Party might lose a few seats to the Liberal Party, resulting in either a Labor majority or a Labor-led minority government. But there might be other factors coming into play now. From the influence of the Muslim vote, there might be other areas as well. And there was that suggestion that Climate 200 would be targeting Labor seats at the next election, but they've decided to target an additional 9 coalition seats instead. But whatever the case is, every seat will be critical at the next election, or at least that there will be more seats that are critical than there usually are. And with the timing of the next election, Labor, I think, was banking on getting some sort of political boost out of the Stage 3 tax cuts, and those tax cuts will be applied to pay packets from this week onwards. And because of all of the issues over the past week, all the messages that the Labor government was wanting to put out over Stage 3 tax cuts, well, they were all pretty much drowned out. And it might be a case where people don't care about the tax cuts anyway. They'll just accept them but not give the government any thanks at all about it. And I think the Labor government might have too much riding on this idea of interest rate reductions as well. And over the past couple of weeks, they haven't looked like a government in control of the issues. Now, that will change because the nature of political issues changes every week or two, but I think they just have to put the past 2 weeks behind them and get back onto the main issues again.
Yeah, as critical as we've been of the Labor Party, and will continue to be, a lot of it is to do with first-term jitters. It's easy to listen to the loudest voices, not necessarily the best voices. And I think they need to ignore calls for the early election. I think the Liberal Party is in an existential crisis too. And I think that Climate 200 is chasing the Liberal Party. Maybe, as its detractors will say, it was always an anti-Liberal, pro-Labor thing, and all of the teals are Marxist socialists, all of them. But I also think that it's where they think they're going to get their bigger successes. The Labor seats may be a little bit more loyal to the party than the Liberal seats, because the Labor Party hasn't moved away from its core beliefs as far as the Liberal Party has. I'm not saying it hasn't moved. I want to make that perfectly clear. But there's still elements, and the government has done some good things, most of which have been cancelled out by the supported genocide. But there are achievements that the government has done, and there's achievements that even ministers we've been highly critical of have done. And I think the electorate tends to notice that. And I think that Climate 200 have realised that it's easier to target useless Liberal backbenchers than it is to target relatively competent Labor ministers and backbenchers. That's not a criticism of Climate 200. They basically spreading resource around. They don't want to see those resources wasted. And probably, I suspect that if I was doshing out the campaign funds I'd feel pretty much the same.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.
I have to celebrate you, baby. I have to praise you like I should.